Propaganda by the Seed is a joint collaboration between Edgewood Nursery and the Soulcast. To get 10% off of your Edgewood Nursery order of plants, seeds, and trees, visit edgewood-nursery.com and use Soulcast at checkout. And if you want to support the Soulcast, you can go to patreon.com/SOLEONE. Now, before we get into this episode, let's hear from some comrades in the Channel Zero Podcast Network.
Hello, and welcome to We Will Remember Freedom, a monthly podcast of anarchist fiction. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to Live Like the World is Dying, your podcast for what feels like the end times. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to the jingle for both of my podcasts. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. You can find my podcasts wherever you get your podcasts or get them from the Channel Zero Network.
Let's go for it.
Mike Spade, welcome to Propaganda by the Seed.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Where are you at right now? You're in Denver?
Yeah, I'm in Denver. A little neighborhood called Berkeley. I really like it out here.
Very nice place. Berkeley's a very nice little neighborhood. Shout out to, what's that Indian chain in Berkeley that just opened up? I forget. I actually like it. It's like Steve Zissou's Indian or some shit.
You mean the Indian chain that just closed down, Bijou's?
Yeah.
So they were actually one of the victims of COVID, you know? With everything going on, I think that's a franchise we may lose.
Damn, they have good, I think, decent, affordable, macrobiotic, quote-unquote, cuisine. Mm-hmm. Well, another one bites the dust.
Right?
Till it's our turn. What have you been up to, Mike? What's new with you?
New for me, to start a new job. Working still with developers, which is where I would like to be in the long run as green roofing professional. But right now kind of transitioning into a property management role. So we have a new public market here in Denver. Actually, it's the neighborhood of Edgewater. There was a strip mall that had a King Soopers as an anchor over in the Edgewater community. This King Soopers vacated and moved to a strip mall about less than half a mile away. And so what happened was all the other vendors that were in that initial strip mall ended up pretty much collapsing because the anchor of the strip mall left. So it's been this like desolate area besides this one liquor store pretty much since I've moved to Denver. And so just last year, it was turned into this public market food hall. And with COVID, they're looking for people to come in and just make sure we're all abiding by the rules and trying to stay safe, that things are clean. And so I function as market supervisor there, and that's kind of taken over my life the last 2 weeks.
Oh, so I was reading on Facebook, like you have to you're the person who has to tell people to wear masks, and it doesn't always go so easy, huh?
No, and that's the shocking thing. It's not too many people. Honestly, I would say it's the 1%, you know, the 1 in every 100. But you do get those that just make you question. So, for example, I had somebody this weekend who I saw not wearing their mask. I asked them to put it on. They put it on. It's pretty much as soon as I looked back, they took it off. And so we were in this like cat and mouse game. And finally, I'm like, hey guys, I really need you to wear the mask. And so they look at me and they go, oh, I'm sorry, we're from Florida and it's kind of not a thing there. And I think that's so funny now looking here 2 days later, and Florida has just announced 16,000 new cases. And I'm like, well, it is very much a thing there.
Yeah, that's especially terrifying if they're from Florida.
Right.
Yeah, you need to be extra careful.
Here's another mask for you. And in fact, here's whatever. It's crazy. And yeah, and Mike, you got a kid coming too. Congratulations.
Ooh, yes I do. Dang, getting into the dirt early. Yes, got a little seed on the way.
Congrats. It's
Thank you.
Aaron has a teenager. I have a three-nager, or a three-erist. But it's a hell of a ride.
Yeah, it's never easy, but it's always interesting.
I mean, even now, I feel like in utero, it keeps us on our toes. So, trying to be prepared as best as we can.
A whole nother set of things to think about.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you though, as someone who's always thinking about autonomy and learning the ways to live, without the system, it's I don't know. I feel like it's no big surprise that we're growing up, we're having kids in a period of where the certainty of capitalism doesn't look so sure anymore. But it's like it's an opportunity to raise our kids to be prepared. I guess not to be on some like doomsday, doom and gloom shit, but just to it's an opportunity. It's like we get to learn the skills to do these things and pass them on, and that's like, I don't know, it's something.
And I think a lot of people are coming to that realization. The kids are really, as much as this has had an impact, on us as adults and how we interact with this working world and what is our existence now without this, work life here, especially in America. We have this, you have 40 hours a week. And honestly, the people that are supposedly doing the best, they're really doing 70 plus hours a week. So what are you doing with your life? It's kind of like this American attitude towards like work and life existence. And I think having this pause for us as adults, I think is also making us reconsider, okay, so what does this like future going forward look like for kids? And so I think as much as there is some like doom and gloom, I've also seen some things that make me hopeful. Like you look at LA, and you got 35,000 teachers that are banding together to say, pretty much we're going to hold our district hostage unless you defund the police 50%.
Totally. Yeah,
school's supposed to start back, in August 18th for them. We're 5 weeks away from that point, and I think we need to start putting the pressure on our elected officials. Right? If you want us to go into these schools and take these risks as somebody that's been an after school like service provider, I'm going to need you to take these precautions. And also I'm going to demand that you treat my people better. And I seeing things like that gives me hope for the future.
Yeah, totally.
Excellent.
I keep tripping off the whole fact that we're talking about abolition, like in the mainstream media now, things seemed very hopeless a year ago. I was reading this piece about 40 days in the desert of like Jesus of Nazarene or whatever, walking through the desert for 40 days after, I don't really know the Bible, but like comparing quarantine to like a walk in the desert. Like this is when we can try to clear our minds and reimagine. And it's like it's a deeply reflective period for a lot of people. And that hopefully that's good. But well, Mike, I know you from we took a permaculture design course together, and we're some of the only hip hop heads in there. So we,
Yep.
And it's funny now that I'm back on the East Coast, all I do is like listen to like 90s Nas and shit. It's funny. But yeah, and so I really didn't know at the time that you did rooftop gardening stuff. And so I guess if you wanted to kind of talk about like, what got you into this and how did you come to rooftop gardening?
Yeah. I was kind of thinking about it myself before this call, and I think it's just sort of that nexus, like right place, right time. I grew up in Queens, New York City. but I tested into Stuyvesant High School for high school. So even though I lived in Jackson Heights, Queens, which is one of the most diverse neighborhoods, probably in New York City, it's where, Alexandra AOC always talks about having, 200 plus languages spoken in her district. I grew up in this neighborhood, but would take the train an hour and a half every day to high school to Tribeca. On the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So from there, I just saw, very stark differences, right, between my neighborhood at home that I'm living in, I'm growing up in, versus what I'm seeing every day in school. And I also just had a very different community. I had friends in high school. I remember going over to their house for the first time, and, they have Emmys and such in the living room. And that was something that just wasn't attainable, for me as my family was homeless in 4th grade and bounced through the shelter system for a while. So just saw these very stark differences in our neighborhoods. But one of the great things about Tribeca at that time was Tribeca was leading the world and the nation in LEED development. So we had the Solaire, which was America's first LEED certified residential high-rise, developed right by my school.
Hey, can I cut you off really quickly? I've never heard this phrase LEED. What does that mean?
Yeah, so it's Leaders in Environmental Design. So it's pretty much like a rating system. So it's LEED. It's a rating system which can be used to signify how environmentally friendly a building is. And at its highest level, we're talking about buildings that are actually putting energy back into the grid, buildings that are, having green roofs, which are purifying the air. So getting away from an extractive model of building and getting into a model where we can actually use these buildings to purify our environmental, the environment around us, or better the environment around us. So that's really what LEED is a rating system of. And it gets down into, is there geothermal heating? Are there bike racks? Is there showers for people, that bike to work and then want to take a shower, right? Like, you're going to need all of these things. Are there low flow, toilets, to make sure that you're efficiently using water. And so LEED is really a rating system designed to tell people how environmentally friendly a building is. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry, yeah, I'd never heard that phrase, and I'm sure others hadn't. So, okay, so so then what? Then how did you start, getting into rooftop design? I mean, that's designing these rooftop gardens.
Right. So I think it was, seeing these buildings, right? So you have the Solaire. There was also the Visionaire, which was the first LEED Platinum condominium on the whole East Coast, and the Verdesian. So there were these 3 apartment complexes that went up, or condos that went up within a couple of years of each other while I was in high school. And all new for New York City, but also new for pretty much the East Coast. And so there, visiting friends and, just hanging out in the area, I saw my first green roofs. And if I can be honest, when I was, going for college and trying to make a decision on what I want to do with my life, I was like, there's always going to be money in real estate, and I think this is the future of real estate. And for me, it was mostly purely financial, at that point. This seems like a safe route. So my first 2 years in college, I spent the summer doing independent research on green roofs, and how they could be used in buildings. And then the second year was specifically how green roofs could be used to grow food. During that next year, my junior year, I was going to Stony Brook University at the time, and the university decided that they wanted to build a rooftop garden at the university hospital. So I had a couple of teachers that were like, hey, Mike, you've been doing all this, independent research. How about actually trying to get your hands dirty? So that was, once again, just right place, right time. I started working on that green roof. It was only 2,500 square feet, so very, minuscule in terms of scale. We're talking scale of commercial green roofs. But for me, coming from New York City, it was my first time growing my own food. right? And seeing a system where at that roof, all of the produce we grew stayed on site and went to hospital patients that had dietary restrictions. So not only seeing, food growing and being a part of that, but also seeing this holistic system. And, okay, I just literally go and harvest this and then put it in a tub, take it downstairs, hand it off to a chef who washes it, and then it's back out, and served to a patient later that day, if not later that week. And so that was my first time really seeing, this interaction up close, and I think that got me hooked.
That is cool. That is so cool. I would say just at right place, right time, but also doing the right thing. A lot of times, like whoever gets there first, is the gets to do the cool shit. That's awesome. So, so I tried growing shit on my roof in Denver, and it was just a fucking bad idea. I had irrigation going up there, water dripping all over the roof. Shit started getting heavy and knocking back and forth, and everything just fucking cooked up there. There's nothing I could do. So that's my experience with rooftop gardening. And if I had only, I did it right before I got my PDC. So it was like, oh shit, if only we'd met a year earlier.
Right.
But yeah, so I guess I'm just wondering, in general, right? Do you feel like the rooftop garden is when we're looking at everything that's happening in the world with capitalism and climate change and COVID and, whatever's going to happen next, do you see rooftop gardening as a sustainable solution for food production? For the future, or how do you think about it, in terms of, I don't know, I guess a strategy, or in terms of its capacity to provide for us?
Good question. I think in terms of capacity, I think the capacity is immense, right? Ideally, if we're thinking every flat roof, if we could put agriculture, like a green roof designated for agriculture on every flat roof, right? Like that, we're talking immense systematic change. But if I can be honest about what I've seen in the green roofing industry, that's not what we're seeing, right? Your everyday homeowner isn't putting green roofs on their roof at a price point of, as much as $50 per square foot. Even a small implant, like what I was talking about before, 2,500 square feet, we're now talking about in excess of $100,000, right, for that construction. And who has that money, especially in a time where, we're seeing unemployment rising and industries collapsing pretty much. So what I have seen is, yes, there are still high-priced residential contracts. I have still gotten contracts. Actually, I am subcontracted to. I work for Green Roofs of Colorado, and they subcontract to me when we work together. So there's still those high-priced residential. We still have some high-priced commercial projects coming up, downtown. But I think when you're talking about how much capacity does this have for this systemic change, I think it needs to become more accessible. And at the price point right now, it just isn't accessible. And so I think we need to see partnerships and marriages like how we saw with the solar industry. Can our governmental buildings and our public libraries, can those spaces offer up their roofs to be leased out to other people, private entities, who could take them over and steward them as rooftop farms? And I think if we see that, and while making sure that the general public has access, I think, yes, we can see some change. But as you're seeing rooftop gardens implemented now, they're mostly limited to the wealthy, or they're limited to the people that are institutionalized. I've built green roofs at hospitals. So people that are paying a high price point already, to better their health. And then I think another option would be schools. But once again, I think it all comes down to making sure, how do we make sure it's a public resource and not just an amenity for the rich? Only a third of rooftop farms succeed. And a lot of that is because once you put such a high upfront cost into developing the roof and retrofitting and designing and selecting the plants, it's really hard to recoup those costs on vegetables alone. So for a rooftop farm to be successful, they have to kind of lean into this event sphere and become these like wedding venues and such. So I think what we need to see is just, if people are going to put the money up for them to just grow food and be successful, I think we need to have the time given to do that. Otherwise, we see them rushed into being, event venues, and we lose the focus on the food production. So yeah, I say, yes, I do see the potential, but I also see, as things are being exacted now, the business model is moving towards events, right, and not agriculture. So I don't know if that necessarily gets us to where, you and I would like to see, okay, there's food grown on every roof. That can be accessible for the general community.
Well, what makes that so expensive? Why, what are if I wanted to do it myself, let's say I had a flat roof on my house and I wanted to do it myself, what would be the biggest challenges financially?
Right. It depends on where you are. But really, as a green roofing professional, you're a project manager, right? So you're getting the engineers together, right, to make sure that you can put, like you were saying, you were probably skeeved out by how much weight you put on your roof with the soil, especially once that soil gets wet and you have a serious weather event. It can be sketchy. I've been up on roofs that you feel like they're moving, while the soil's being put up there. You're like, I don't really know about this. So I think, yeah, it's having that consultation with the engineers, right? As you were saying, you had a lot of plants die. Last summer, when I was a rooftop farm manager, we had temperatures recorded of as high as 117 degrees. A lot of plants can't withstand that. So then are you consulting somebody to make sure that you're choosing the right plants? Because you have to choose very specific plants. If you're, for most people that are growing, vegetated roofs, are growing sedum, so that they're not as intensive of a root system. You only need about 3 inches of soil media or your media, which once again bring that weight load down. And so I think it's this, you're back and forth between, okay, now I've added, I know what filter fabric I want to use. I know what waterproofing membrane I want to use, right? And those pieces can be costly. Then you look at adding in your flashing and your elements that will stabilize and hold it down. Those can be costly. Once you talk about adding your soil, how are you adding your soil? And this is where a lot of the price point comes in, depending on where you're at. So if I'm doing a smaller residential build here, we may just fill up the back of a truck with our soil media, and then use buckets, right? And carry it up to the roof, 50 pounds at a time. But for larger projects, like the project that I worked on downtown Denver last year, we had to get a permit for a truck to come in, a blower truck to come in, extend the tube 6 stories up the side of a building, and then, use pretty much this air chute to shoot soil into our beds. And so at that system we had 40 8x12 beds, all varying between 2 to 4 feet in height. And that took about 8 hours for them to do, using this blower machine. And I can't imagine how many days it would have taken us if we had to actually use buckets and stuff. But when you're talking about getting permits to block off the city, getting permits to shut down a block, getting a truck to come in, then getting the labor force to actually come and do that, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars of cost right there, especially in a city like New York. Where I started, so it really depends on where you're at and what the scale is. But a lot of that cost can come in just in trying to figure out how to get the soil on the roof safely, purchasing the soil, getting it up there, and then your design process, right? If you're not familiar with plants and design, you're going to have to pay a designer, $100, $150 an hour to go through a consultation process with you of how should my roof look. And so that's some of where that price comes in.
Well, what if I am just living in an apartment and I want to grow food on my roof? Like, instead of like, if I don't want to do a full on, I don't have all that money, but I know like shit's hitting the fan and I want to produce like squash and tomatoes or something. I'm wondering if you think there's like a simple way to just have like raised beds on a roof, or can do container gardening stuff, or if or like what vegetable crops do you find do the best on rooftops?
Yeah, good question. I think that is possible. Like I have seen people do raised beds on roofs and ones that are maybe like 1 foot by 4 foot, 1 foot wide, 4 foot long, and 4 feet tall. I have done a couple of those on roofs. But typically what I see with those is people really using them as herb gardens. Because it's just about space. How many of those are you going to put up there? How willing are you to maintain them? And then once again, like what crops are you going to use? Because do you want to choose something fussy? Do you want to choose something with less maintenance? Things that I've seen do well. Beans. Beans actually did really well last year, and I was surprised at how well some of the beans did. And outside of that, your leafy greens are always going to be resilient, especially if you're using any kind of like hoop cover just to insulate them from the hail or the UV. But I think still you're limited, especially if you're talking about for an apartment, in what you can grow.
Huh. I mean, it makes sense that herbs could take the heat. Did you ever try eating sedum?
No, I actually haven't tried eating sedum. Have you?
Yeah, it's kind of weird. I guess it's like somewhere between, in my opinion, between okra and what is that shit? Purslane. Is that how you would describe it, Aaron?
Yeah, like mucilaginous.
Yes.
And I think not all species are edible. So definitely, check for the listeners. Check what species you're growing and make sure they're actually edible. I don't think any of them are like dangerously poisonous, but good to know exactly what you're eating. And the most commonly eaten one that I've eaten the most of is actually no longer botanically classified as sedum. It's now telthium, which I think is maybe not the species that is commonly used in green roofs, because it's more of like an upright one rather than like a creeping ground cover shaped one.
Well, what about the radiant, obviously, I feel like what killed me in Denver was the radiant heat from the roof cooking the plants. And I tried laying white tarp down everywhere, but that didn't seem to help at all. Just provided more surfaces for water to hide and mold and decay under.
Right.
So is that why you had to build the raised beds 4 feet high?
Well, I think, you definitely want some of that insulation from the surface. And I think it depends. If you're putting down a bunch of, I'll give you an example. So last year we were constructing there's a 6-story parking garage on Larimer Square, in Denver. And so we shut down the top floor of parking spaces, which was I think about 40 plus parking spaces, and converted that into a vegetable production farm. And so I think with that, we were scared about how much heat the concrete would absorb and release into the soil media. So we definitely wanted to have more soil to make sure we had that insulation. But there's materials that you can use in the roofing process to achieve the same effect. But once again, that's where you're getting into like the cost, right?
Well, let me ask you this. What do you think is like the main, like, so you've done it in New York, which is like a closer climate to where I live, except for in the summer it probably gets a little hotter, and you've done it in Denver. One area is humid and at sea level, the other is arid and in the mountains and some semi-desert like. Is there anything that like what are some of the biggest challenges or differences between growing in those environments?
The hail. So I was hired last year, to build out a roof farm in late June. So I planted a couple $1,000s worth of plants, going around at that time and trying to get seedlings. A lot of nurseries didn't have exactly what I wanted, so I was piecing together to try and create the design that I wanted. So not having necessarily the plants that I wanted, but then also you're dealing with the elements, right? So I put these plants in and immediately they're going up against, 90 plus degree weather every day from the minute they're transplanted. And then I think a week after planting, we had quarter-size hail on July 4th, which ended up making me have to rip out most of the plants and then go and buy another couple $1,000s worth of plants the following day to replant. So I think you're up against the elements out here. You definitely don't have that, or I haven't seen that quarter-size hail, or as frequent or devastating as hail events as we have out here in Colorado. But then again, it comes down to what plants you're choosing, because I think you were out here for the hailstorm that shut down Colorado Mills, right?
If you're referring to the time when I lost all my tomato plants and everything else I'd planted in my yard, yes.
Yeah. So it was
that was like you had to like pull over on the side of the road because there was literally like 3 to 4 inches of hail on the street. It looked surreal. Right. It's in Denver. It is cost-wise, it is the worst environmental disaster, from how many roofs were damaged, how many cars, how many buildings. But something that we noticed at the green roofing company that I do work with, Green Roofs of Colorado, he said a lot of my boss, Andy Creef, who's been working in green roofing for over a decade, was just like, a lot of my customers were really happy because at the end of the day, they only had to replace a few plants, as opposed to other people, who had these large insurance claims for, thousands, probably tens of thousands of dollars. Having to spend $100 on plants is relatively feasible, So I think, yes, the weather is something that you have to deal with when green roofs, but I think you can also choose plants that make it less make it less scary of an experience, to be honest.
Yeah, and shit, if it's just succulents just getting smashed up everywhere, that just means more succulents.
Right, exactly. And so he was like, it actually helped to spread seed, to have that event and to make sure that the roof was more well covered. So yeah, I think it's just choosing plants that work for the environment, so that you're not constantly fighting that battle.
Well, as I hear you talk about this stuff, it seems to me like this whole, the idea of rooftop gardening is not necessarily a very sustainable practice. I remember when it got passed in Denver, our teachers or whatever, I think Adam and Creighton were talking about the amount of resources that have to go into greening a roof pretty much cancel out the environmental benefits. And if they're so prohibitively expensive like this, it doesn't. If it seems to me like maybe this isn't necessarily like a like a sustainable answer to food problems.
No, I think if you're talking about trying to solve the world's food issues, I don't know that rooftop gardening as it exists is the answer. Because as I was saying, it's most of the times people are using it as a business when they're rooftop gardening, and it's just hard to make that money back on vegetable margins alone. You just have slim margins there as it is. So I think, without substantial investment by whales, that can wait to recoup some of their money, I don't think that you're going to see, rooftop gardening as, as a tool that's used on the forefront of, bringing agriculture back. Like, I don't see that happening just because of how expensive it is at this point. As you're saying, everybody can afford that. And we all have to approach this at ways that are feasible and attainable for us. So I don't think right now that it is attainable for everyone to have a rooftop garden. But I think as the industry moves forward, we can learn and take our lessons and think about, okay, how can we bring this cost down some? And maybe then, we can start to see that this is a viable practice.
So, like, the main costs are what? Like, getting the dirt in there, getting the water up there, and reinforcing the roof so that it can support an extra 20 tons or whatever?
Right, and also the water, right? You have to make sure that it's pretty much impervious to water, because if you have water that's seeping through, like you have an extreme rain event, and the water seeps through your waterproofing membrane and now is getting into the structure of the roof, you have the possibility for some serious damage there. So I think, there's a lot of risk involved. And I think to make sure that you are eliminating that risk, there's just cost associated with that. You have to consult all the professionals in the different the different respective industries, having an engineer, talking to the architect, talking to a designer, and then making sure you're consulting with the city, the county, to make sure all your permits are pulled. And I think all of that just becomes a cumbersome and costly process.
Can I jump in for a second there?
Sure.
So it seems like one element of this is like retrofitting green roofs is really super complicated and expensive.
Right.
But potentially for new construction, it sounds like if that's already kind of baked into the plan, if you're going to build anything new, you're already going to be talking to that engineer. When you put in the roof to begin with, it's probably cheaper to build it right for a green roof than to retrofit an existing roof. And that space of rooftops is, as long as there are human-made buildings, there's going to be that rooftop space. And it seems like while green roofs aren't going to like feed the city, that's just impossible. There's just not enough space. It seems like it is a really good use of that space. Does that jibe with your experience?
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think it is much easier with a new building and less costly, right? Because you're already, like you're saying, in contracts with all of those people, and you're already pulling all of those permits anyway. But I think what we're seeing is that a lot of the industry is going for older buildings, right? We're retrofitting them to try and, lengthen their lifeline pretty much. But I think with our green roofing mandates, like we have in Denver, I think New York City actually just imposed one as well. I think we have an opportunity with new construction to kind of change how that is thought about, like you were saying, Aaron. But I think what needs to happen is we need to make sure developers aren't given outs. So here in Denver, the green roofing mandate, even though it's called, green roofing in name, developers can also opt to just put in a white roof. and that also qualifies for this green roof mandate, or they can provide funding for urban agriculture ventures in other areas, which is it ends up being a few $1,000s, which is a route that most people go just because it's less costly. And so as much as we have these mandates, if the mandates don't have teeth to them, where we're actually saying like, hey, you have to implement a green roof, if we're allowing people to skirt out and just put money in the funds, developers are always going to do what's easiest for them and what makes the most sense financially. So so as much as I, once again, am happy to see that we're having these mandates, I think that we need to look at what they're actually causing in terms of the actions that the industry is taking. Like, are they spurring the results that we want to see, or is there some unforeseen consequence that's actually arising? And I think that's what we're seeing. That there are some unintended consequences where developers are opting out. And white roofs are great as well. We need to think about how we can reflect, some of the heat. But I think that's not what people that are pushing for green roof, and especially in a green roof mandate, are looking for.
Do you have any information on like how like it affects the temperature? Like if it's like, have they done experiments on like entire neighborhoods where they are using green roofs or whatever, and like measured the temperature to see if it's like it impacted it? Or
that's a good question. I don't know that I've seen it necessarily like for neighborhoods like that. Most of the studies that I've seen for neighborhoods like that have to do more with the implementation of trees and combating urban heat island effects. So I think there is the opportunity for green roofs to do that. For example, the roof that I worked on last year, we did have about 12 trees that we put up there in their own boxes. But I think once again, because you're talking about now needing that larger root structure for having a tree, you're talking about the higher price point. So I don't know if we see too much of that experimented with in the green roofing world. In fact, it's very rare, to be honest.
Would you say like the rooftop climate of like a Denver rooftop would be closer to like Tucson, Arizona?
Sure.
Or does the winter make it unlike the desert?
I think it's pretty similar to the desert. But I just think that it's hard to find an exact replica, Even so last year, at the same time that I was working on the downtown roof, Andy Kreef, who I work with here, was consulted about trying to take an opportunity in Saudi Arabia to implement green roofs on governmental buildings there. And the reason he was reached out to is because people that were consulted in Europe had told the Saudi Arabian government that the American Southwest would be the climate that would be most analogous to what they were looking for. So that's why he was picked to consult and try and help. So I think it's hard because even, the Middle East is not Colorado.
So weird.
You try and find similar, but I don't know if you're ever going to get exactly similar. And so I think it's important to have like a plant palette for your locale.
But yeah, it's like some Anthropocene shit, like these unique man-made, human-made environments that are, whatever, analogous, so, 7,000 miles around the world. It's insane.
Right.
Well, one of the things me and Aaron were also wondering about, as we were talking about this before, was like pollinators. Aaron, I don't know if you wanted to like ask that and Aaron speak.
Yeah.
Sure. I got a whole bunch of questions. So one of the things I was wondering is I assume that pollinators do get up to rooftop gardens, but I was curious if you like have issues with pollination, because it's, especially if you're like 6 stories up, the populations might not be there, and do you ever need to kind of do any hand pollination or do something to particularly attract pollinators or support their populations?
Definitely. No, that's a great question. I think you have to choose plants that will attract pollinators. Even if you're just growing for the agricultural, like at the end of the day, it's a system. And so you need those pollinators to be part of it. But I will tell you pretty much. So I've been working with Green Roofs of Colorado on the Grow and Gather facility here in southern Denver. It's a former auto body shop that's been converted into this cafe, market, restaurant, just really cool space. They've got a rooftop greenhouse. They've got a sub-level roof, which is a planted roof. And we were just there about a month ago putting up soil. And then about a week later, we went in to add in the plants. And I can tell you that first day, like by lunchtime, I could already see bees, visiting the plants that we had put on the roof. And so I think it's just about choosing the right plants, because you do want to engender that relationship, so that you have that natural pollination occurring. I haven't had to go around and like hand pollinate anything myself. But yeah, that's a good question.
Cool. Thank you. So, if you build it, they will come.
Pretty much. But I think also, thinking about proximity, right? How close are you to a roof that does have bees? For example, Larimer Square doesn't have bees, but you do have Union Station in Denver, which is like the big downtown train station. A couple of people have started raising bees there. And for example, on our Grow and Gather roof, the auto body shop, the former auto body shop, there are bees being raised on an adjoining roof as part of the system. So I think it's just for people that are thinking about growing food. I think it's a necessary part of the system to think about pollinators and maybe even trying to raise your own bees.
Cool. Another question I had is, where does fertility come from in these systems? Like when I am thinking about growing in the ground in soil, there's often some waste stream that's being tapped into for fertility, like leaves or whatever, or we're growing cover crops for fertility. But where your space is so confined, I assume that all the fertility really has to be brought in the form of fertilizer. And I was curious what you like to use or how you manage that part of the system.
Definitely. I think that's something so there are a couple proprietary soil mixes that are used in green roofing. Probably the most popular being Roof Light. And so it's got a lot of compost in it, especially for the agricultural mix. And so I think it's choosing a media that works and has the right compost, the right amount of compost in the mixture. But I think it's also checking up and making sure that if you're not getting the right amount of nutrients, can somebody come out and spray Compost Tea? There's a lovely young lady, Shelby Kaminsky, out here who runs a Compost Tea business, Adaphic Solutions. And so last year when I started noticing that we were nutrient deficient up on the roof, I was able to have her, come up and spray down all of our plants with Compost Tea. So I do think that just like your average garden, you still have to add amendments and treat it. And so it's just a constant maintenance, and I think that's what's hard about green roofs. A lot of people just want to put the plants up there and leave nature to its devices and hope for the best. And it's like, no, just like your average garden, you have to show it love and care. And it's a constant, process of watching and revising and reassessing the situation.
Well,
Very cool. That makes a lot of sense.
Can I jump in and ask a quick question? So the compost tea, I've never actually, I've heard, I think Driscoll's uses compost tea exclusively, but I've never really heard of, I've never heard them used like that. So I'm just curious, like, after you sprayed them with compost tea, was that all the nutrients you had to add? And they produced fine?
Well, they still didn't produce fine, just because, we got a late start. We started in late June. We had that early hailstorm. And then once we got through that, we had like a heat wave. So there was just a lot of environmental factors that played into that roof underperforming, which happens.
I just love the idea of, because if you're thinking about like a closed system like that, the idea of just having a little compost tea bubbling on the side, it's like that's such a simple and easy way. As you were talking, it was reminding me like, oh shit, this is like gardening on Mars in some ways,
Right. And so I think in trying to figure out like ways to make this system work, I think it's moving from beyond like what I do on my roof to like what this neighborhood can do on their on this compilation of roofs, right? Because now if I say my roof is, I'm growing all of our root vegetables. The roof next to me is growing all of our leafy greens. Across the street, we've got beehives. Across the street, we've got one that's just making compost tea in a dome. We've got aquaponics going on our block. Now we're talking about a self-sufficient system. But I think once again, it takes the village, right? And it's not just what can I do? And I think right now you're seeing individual buildings and individual entities like raise these roofs. But I think where we'll start seeing that systematic change that I think all three of us would want to see is when we start talking about neighborhood wise, right? Like, and community wise, like how are we planning and structuring these together to combat these forces of inequality?
Hell yeah. Aaron, did you have more questions?
Oh, I definitely do. So another thing that occurred to me while we were talking is, do you grow pretty much exclusively annuals as far as production? It seems like the green roof side of things, where you mentioned sedum being a really common one. So it sounds like there might be more perennials on that side of things. But I was curious if there were any perennials that you grow for food, and then if you could maybe talk a little bit about the difference between what is a green roof and what is like more of a rooftop garden or rooftop farm, and how is there a difference there, and how do those things differ?
Right. So your first question, could you repeat that again?
Yeah. Do you use any perennials that you grow for food?
So last year, I don't know that we've necessarily tried many perennials for food. We did do some perennials for pollinators, but we didn't use perennials for food. Mostly it's annuals for food, and I think for that it's just about being able to give the roof some time to rest, because you're not going to be up there a lot during the winter.
Yeah.
I think something we did was to try and put in some oats and stuff just to bring fertility back to the soil. But we didn't use I think it's mostly annuals from what I've seen when you're talking about rooftop gardens in your rooftop farms. If you're just talking about green roofs, it's mostly perennials. And so the distinction I would really make there between those, like, what's a rooftop garden and a rooftop farm, and what's a green roof or just like a vegetated roof, like what are the differences? I think it really comes down to your soil media and how deep it is. So usually mostly of what you see in the green roofing industry is trays, right? People make trays that are 2 foot by 2 foot, 4 foot by 4 foot, however. But it's usually a 3-inch deep tray that has some sedum in it, right? So you're talking very shallow systems. And then with that, you're not going to be able to grow, your root vegetables, or you're not going to be able to grow most vegetables for the most part. But if we're talking rooftop gardens, rooftop farms, now you're talking we're talking 1 to 4 feet of soil media. So just because of the volume of soil media, you're incurring those costs there. But what you're looking at is it allows that space for the roots to expand. And then you can have your taller plants. You can go and start growing your squashes, your corn, start getting into those plants that send down taproot systems. So I think those would be the biggest distinctions for me. Like, are you using, set in trays and just plopping them down kind of like Legos, in really shallow systems? Or are you getting into the, extensive, where you're using, you're extending a tube and, blowing soil media up so you can fill up a reservoir, so that, you have that space for that, taproot system or the root system in general.
Cool. That's a great distinction. I didn't really understand quite the difference there before. That's excellent. Let's see. What about you mentioned having problems with hail and needing to protect from hail. Are you ever using sort of like a hoop structure or something like that to have like a light shade cloth or something that's like a physical barrier to hail?
So last year after seeing the hail damage, we even had, hoops on, at that time with shade cover. It just so happened that we had taken the shade cover off for the night because it was July 4th and we were watching fireworks. So at that point it was already 9 p.m. The sun had gone down. We thought it would be cool, and just out of nowhere, we got this like freak hailstorm, and our row covers weren't up at the time, so we took a beating. So I think, trying to make sure that you can have row covers and systems to protect. But even when you have those systems, rain or your hail could come in an instant, and if you're unprepared, it can wipe out your whole crop. So even if you do take precautions, it's hard.
I love the human error and randomness element that just, that's like that's not in any of the books I read. Like the one time you get caught slipping, shit hits the fan, it sucks. What about onion roofs? Have you ever heard of these like Swedish or Norwegian onion roofs? Have you ever seen those?
No, enlighten me.
Aaron, do you know what they're called?
I don't remember beyond onion roof off the top of my head, but I seem to remember Stephen Barstow talking about using various types of perennial alliums in green roofs in somewhere, definitely Scandinavian. But I think they were like very old style, like sod roofs. Right. Not like the modern, like membranes with all sorts of engineering on them.
I guess I'm just throwing that out there as just as you were just describing all the dirt on the roof, I was thinking to myself, oh shit, like the picture of those onion roofs popped into my head, and just like as an aesthetic flourish, I just thought that could be a really cool, because that could probably even do okay in Denver. I mean, onions, scallions don't mind the Colorado climate, that's for sure.
We did have some ornamental allium up on the roof last year, so they do pretty well, and they were definitely like an attractor for pollinators too. And I love that you mentioned the sod roofs, because I think, when we look back at like the history of green roofs, right? Like they talk about, like when I took my green roofing courses, one of the first things they tell you about is like yes, our standards here in the U.S. are relatively new. If you go further back, standards that we developed ours on that come from Germany, they're based in like the 1970s. But if you're thinking about really like where does this idea of planted roofs, vegetated roofs, sod roofs come from, it's actually been attributed to the Vikings. So apparently the Vikings would dock, turn their ship over, and then pretty much add soil and sod on top of on what was formerly the bottom of the ship, but was now the roof of their home. And so it's awesome to think about like how we've come from that, right? So now we can go into these high-rise condominium buildings, where each condo is $2 million. And a much smaller imprint of the roof is planted, but it takes so much more engineering, and people. And to me, it kind of cracks me up to see like they were able to do this, 1,000 years ago without all of these processes and these air chutes and all these like proprietary soil mixes and stuff, and it's, have we advanced or are we taking us back?
Oh my God, that's hilarious. That's crazy. Aaron, had you heard of that Viking ship before?
No, that sounds amazing. And yeah, it's, I think that fits right in with the onion roof thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like in my yard, like we had this gigantic carport, so it wasn't actually my roof, and we just always hung out under the carport. And I was like, man, this should be a growing space, and just wasn't sound enough. But yeah, it's I love the idea of like things that you hang out under, or like a tool shed. Like basically, that's what I want to do with my shed in my yard, is just put an onion roof on it. I think that'd be fun. Well, Aaron, did you have any other technical rooftop questions?
Yeah. So, while we're talking about all this, I figured it'd be good to ask you, Mike, about just like really simple, really small scale stuff for people who maybe have, live in an apartment and have access to a little roof space, and it's definitely not feasible to do anything huge, but if they want to have like a container garden up there. Are there any implications from, something as simple as a few self-watering containers made out of 5-gallon buckets that they should be considering? And if you had any recommendations for like what sort of soil medium, because it seems like that's a big part of the picture, is getting the right soil medium, and any just sort of tips for people who want to try very small scale DIY rooftop gardening.
Yeah, I think at small scale, I think you could still use, whatever media you would buy from the store, or from, the nursery for your backyard or for your front yard, because you're not going to be worried about the weight as much. I think the medium becomes important when you're doing the larger projects and you're trying to cut weight down, because you're worried about the ability of the roof to hold that weight. But I think for your person that just wants to like tip your toes into this and try something out, I wouldn't worry about the media too much. It's just whatever you would use for your garden or at home, that you could use the same thing. The one precaution I would take is you still want to make sure you're insulating the structure from moisture, and you still want to make sure you're facilitating drainage. So I think making sure that you still have some kind of waterproofing membrane, and then that you maybe have like a filter fabric that you lay down under it. And those don't have to necessarily be too expensive. At the low end, I think green roofs, you're quoted at like $16, per square foot. And so I think there with like a couple $100, you could do like a 10 square foot area, where you have like a little container garden. So I think if you're just starting out, I think making sure that you're you have ways to get water off the roof because you just don't want to incur any damage to your roofing structure, your home because of that, especially if you're renting. I'm sure your landlord would be very angry with you if you cause structural damages. So yeah, I'm going to put this disclaimer out there. I am not telling you to go and garden on your apartment roof. I am no way, shape, or form advocating for that. But if you have a home, you own your home, you want to try things out, go for it.
Cool. Thank you. And my last question here is, it seems like extraordinary rainfall events are definitely a factor that you're considering frequently. Of like, oh, what happens if it rains 3 inches in an afternoon? For those heavy rainfall events, do you ever build in rainwater capture systems so that you can capture some of that rainwater to use for irrigation later?
Right. I haven't yet, but I think in the ideal system, like in a permaculture-based system, like, yeah, you absolutely have to think about how can we try and reuse some of that water. And honestly, that's where a good amount of the funding, for green roofing is coming. If you look at, New York City, New York has combined sewage overflow systems, right? So when we have these large, weather events, you end up with, the water that's running through the streets has sewage in it, right? And so we have to think of ways that we can start slowing, that water from reaching the ground level and from reaching, our water infrastructure. And so green roofs play a huge role in that, because if you have 3 to 6 inches or more of soil media that can absorb some of that water, especially if we're talking community-wide, you're largely insulated from these weather events that could be catastrophic otherwise. So I think at the community level, that is going to be huge, and that's honestly where some of the largest funding is. So for our folks out there, if you're listening, you want to get a green roof project going, trying to use it as a combatant for rainflow and just slowing the rate of water making it into our combined sewage overflow systems. If your city has that, is a great opportunity to use green roofs. And that's where I see them really coming in handy. May not necessarily be like the agricultural reasoning, but they can still environmentally and financially help us out a lot in that factor.
It's also crazy because Colorado all along has had these laws that make it like a pretty steep offense to collect water. You're not like Colorado because that area was supposed to be like feeding the Colorado River, whatever the reason was. It was illegal to collect water, and now you can only collect, what is it, Mike? Like per
255 gallon barrels a year.
I mean, that's nothing.
Oh,
yeah,
that's wild.
In the most brittle environment, it's like, and this is what they talked about in our permaculture course, because in Colorado, permaculture, like a quarter of the conversation is just always about water, and like, their beef with it was like all this shit is going into the sewers and then just pumping out into an aqueduct, and it's not benefiting anyone. It's just basically drying up along the aqueduct when it could be like trapped in trees that would lower the temperature and bring the rain. And it's 255 gallon buckets. Is that true for like these bigger buildings also, Mike?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if it's the same for like commercial, but I know that is the limit for residential.
Wild. Yeah, so I think what I'm, just like so many of the other things that we're talking about, a lot of this stuff is like, at least in the modern discourse, is like somewhat, it's a frontier. It's a place where a lot of innovation and experimentation is happening. And so it's like, just, as like a hacker, by nature, all this shit sounds just really cool and really, I don't know, like hearing all this shit about the money doesn't make me not want to do it, it just makes me want to figure out like how can it happen? Because I think like the idea of it on top of a school, like that would blow my fucking mind. If I was a kid and I had a rooftop garden, like maybe a raised beds on the ground isn't cool, but like I would feel so fucking cool if I was just like pulling snap peas off my roof. It would be awesome. And it would,
and there, go for it.
And no one knows what the net, what the net outcome of exposing kids to that kind of shit, especially with everything that's happening in our world, like anything that we can do to get people creatively engaged with, the natural world is completely necessary.
Yeah. I wanted to just touch on, you're so right in talking about how this movement is in its infancy, right? Like, when we talk about, Germany, where we take our standard from green roofing, even Germany, who's thought of as a leader, I'm looking and it says 14% of all roofs have been greened, right? 14% is still a very low threshold for a country that's supposed to be the leader. And so I think there is a lot of growth to come. When I look at, the green roofing mandate here, there still are things to be ironed out. Right? To be a green roofing professional, as assigned by the county or the city here, there's some very obscure rules that you have to abide by. And so even my boss, who has been installing green roofs for 12 years and is being consulted by governments across the world, to build these, even he can't get the accreditation from the new office that we have here that's dedicated towards green roofing. He has to pretty much start fresh, right? And so I think you have to have 2 years on a roof, and that means actually 2 years of 40 hours a week building roofs. And they're not counting time planning and consulting and meeting with engineers and stuff towards that. They're only counting actual building time, right? So even somebody that has, a decade of experience still isn't, licensed here technically in the city, just because of the new regulations. And so I think you're very right to touch on we're still in the infancy, and especially in terms of policy and seeing how we can promote these ventures. We have to see what is being exacted by the industry in response to some of these policies that we're developing now, and that will inform how we make these decisions in the future.
That's cool. It's fun. I just can't imagine the feeling of just being up on, whatever the 40th floor of a fucking building and in a city planting shit.
Right.
It's are you afraid of heights? I'd be fuck this.
That's so funny that you mentioned that. Yep, I am scared of heights. And so trying getting up on some of these ladders at first, I feel that was one of the hardest parts for me, just to get over the fear of oh shit, I'm on a ladder this high up, and not only am I on a ladder, I've got a tray of sedum in one hand and a bucket of soil in the other. I'm oh man, this is kind of sketch, at least for me, just because I'm so apprehensive. But I think after a while, it's just repeated exposure. You learn little tips and tricks to keep yourself steady and to be safe. We've never had any incidents where anybody slipped or anything. And you just slow and steady, right, is what I would say. Just slow, steady. Don't try and force anything. Don't try and rush, because that's when mistakes are made. And when the stakes are that high, I don't think anybody wants to take those risks.
Yeah, and just wear an adult-sized diaper if you're carrying it. Hey, in New York, what about moss? Is moss because I was just thinking about hail and just how loud it is when we have hurricane-ish storms here. I was just thinking tin roofs. Everybody in Colorado likes tin roofs, but they're so loud in the hail. And I was just wondering a moss roof seems like, you know, people do graffiti with moss where you mix milk and moss together. It's like, could you just spray a roof with moss? Is that a thing? Has anyone done that? Like, I mean, I know you couldn't just like spray it with moss, but I mean, like a moss roof seems like it would be kind of pleasant and cool.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I actually hadn't encountered that before, and like once you said it, I started looking up because it's funny that you mentioned a moss graffiti. I wanted to do a moss graffiti project in college, you know, and got some good momentum behind it, but oddly enough, the feedback that I got from teachers was once they heard the word graffiti, they stopped listening. But now as I'm looking into the moss roofs, I'm seeing that there are people that are putting like shingles that have moss on them and using that like for roofing, which I haven't seen before. But I think once again, if you want to think about like low cost, like ways to enter the market, like that seems ingenious to me.
Is there an edible kind of moss, Aaron, that you know of, or is all moss kind of edible? You just wouldn't want to.
I don't actually know. I think most moss is actually pretty inedible. Certainly, it's very, very low in nutrients, and I think a lot of those mosses have a lot of chemical defenses to prevent animals from eating them. But I've seen plenty of mossy roofs that were unintentional and definitely a problem. But if you could figure out a good way to keep the moisture on the outside, it would certainly be a very aesthetically pleasing roofing system. And I did talk with someone the other day who was working at a place where they were experimenting with using recycled carpeting as a substrate for growing moss. So you'd basically add some nutrients and then spray on a moss slurry and get like this carpet square basically of moss that you could then very easily transplant. So I think people are interested in it, and I'm sure that's something we'll see in the not too distant future. So if anybody wants to go deep on moss, the Ologies podcast recently had an episode with Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, as she also wrote a book called Gathering Moss, and moss was one of her like professional specialties, and she did a really interesting podcast with Ologies about moss.
That's awesome. She's very cool. Am I losing y'all again? Fuck.
No.
I think we're good now.
I just went deep on like the ologies wormhole. I'm looking at, I'm like, oh man, like there's a scatology, like what? There's a gastroegyptology. Like I didn't even know that was a word for bed breaking. But yep, I'm like, oh, gonna go a deep dive on ologies later.
Yeah, that podcast is really it's a fun listen, and the people that she talks to are just fascinating.
Well, I'm just wondering, we're reaching about like an hour and 20 minutes. I'm just wondering if you have any more, I don't know, like closing thoughts about, Aaron, unless you had any more, did you have any more questions?
No, I think I've asked all the questions. I'll probably think of more later, like 5 minutes after we hang up. But I do want to say thanks to Mike for coming on, and this has been really interesting, and I learned a lot, and it sounds like you're doing some great work out there in Denver.
Hey, thank you guys for having me. It's been a pleasure just to sit and chat with you guys and to learn from you. And speak about green roofing. As I think we've talked about today, green roofing is still in its infancy here. And I'm excited to see where it goes forward. And I think there's a lot of potential, and we have such capacity for change with it as a vehicle. But I'm really interested to see where we go going forward, and how we can start using green roofing and gardening for community level change. Because that's where I think we'll need it the most.
Yeah, totally.
Live from the end of the United States, we need green roofs. People have been sending me all these like apocalyptic articles lately, and I'm just like, yeah, I know. God, I can't believe this is what everyone's talking about now. It's like we're really living through fucking crazy shit. It's I just can't stop tripping off of like, this is like our 1920s moment, how like our lives have just been fucking changed so dramatically, and all these articles I'm hearing are like, now's the time to fucking build your bunk shelter and prepare and learn to grow food and buy some land. But the truth is, just like not everyone's going to be able to do that. So whatever we can do to to localize this sort of shit, I think is very necessary. So it's awesome. It's awesome to see that you're on like the cutting edge of this sort of movement, and it's awesome, Mike. So yeah, thanks for talking to us. And we always like to end with like a book recommendation. I don't know if there's like a book on the subject that you recommend, or a book that doesn't necessarily have to be about that subject that you've been geeking out on lately.
Yeah, I don't necessarily have a green roofing book that I'd like to shout out, but something, with all this current political climate, and, being a young black male that, is going to be raising a black child soon, I have to give a quick plug for the Angela Davis book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. I think it talks about policing and the militarization of the police, and how that struggle is similar to, the struggles of people in Palestine, and how also not only is it similar, but how they can be orchestrated by the same people at some times. And so I think it was eye-opening read for me. And yeah, I would love to get that piece out there for more people.
Cool, I'll check it out. Yeah, one of the things that in Zoe Samudzi, Black is Resistance book, they talk about how black people in America are essentially a stateless people like Palestinians, and that was like I thought a powerful a powerful way of framing it and linking those struggles, because they're definitely linked. That's cool. I don't know that book. So is it a book or an essay?
So it's a book, but the book is actually a compilation of speeches and interviews. So it's an interesting read because it's segmented. But just Angela, being the amazing intersectional feminist that she is, does a great job of making you see like all the connections that even I didn't see, and I think a lot of people don't see. If I can share like one of the tidbits, she talks about how one of the biggest private security companies in the world, one of the biggest companies in the world, I forget what their name is. I think it's G4S, something along those lines. But they're almost as big as Walmart. They're part of the people that have contracts to secure our borders. They're one of the big contracts for private prisons. They also are the people that maintain the fences that separate Israel and Palestine. And so that's when you start talking about like these struggles seem so similar, and these people seem like they're being treated similarly. It's like, oh yeah, it's because the people that are causing that treatment are the same people. and yeah, once you start making those connections, it's like, whoa, like okay, like it's not like an individualized movement here or there, you know, and that's, I think, social media. And I'm so happy that social media has played such a big part in this current like revolution or reckoning that we are seeing. But yeah, it was eye-opening for me to see that these struggles aren't popping up randomly. You know, if they are constructed and contrived, and the results that we are seeing are the results that they were engendered to achieve.
It's fucking disgusting. Yeah, you know, also like walls keep people out, but walls also keep people in, you know, and as we're... Like I saw a map of the United States recently, or I saw the map of the world of all the countries the Americans are banned from right now. And we can go to Canada, the Caribbean, and like that's about it. It's I mean Mexico and the Caribbean and like a couple other places, but even villages in Mexico are like blockading the tourist towns. So like, no, you can't come down here. Like the government might let you in, but we're not. That's an aside, I guess. But yeah, it's so dystopian, Mike. I mean, it's like, right. Like I didn't even know that shit. Like what you were just saying. Like I didn't. It's like it's a fucking onion of oppression.
Yeah, the same people keeping children in cages, you know, in the U.S. are the same people, you know, segregating pretty much Israel and Palestine, and maintaining that segregation, I should say, or, you know, charge the same people profiting off of maintaining that segregation is how plainly we should put it. Yeah.
Yeah, and
yeah, that sounds like a great read.
I will check it out. And I mean, you know, it's important to bring all that up because we are in the midst of a rebellion, like probably the most revolutionary moment any of us have lived through, and it's kind of just getting started. And, you know, a lot of the podcasts I've done and we've done sort of like really focusing on the role of food in all of this. And, you know, between the stress relief of getting your hands in the dirt, but just the ability to like be able to feed an army. We need to be able to feed legions of our people in order to sustain the sort of struggle that is potentially coming. So, again, thanks for being on the cutting edge, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me. And yeah, I'm just glad to be here.
And if people want to track you on social media and, you know, follow your work, where are you most active? What are the, you know, best, and if people have questions, like what's the best way for people to, you know, follow your work and get in touch with you?
Yeah, good question. Probably most active on my Instagram. So I have the nonprofit Plant a Seed Project. Used to be a children's gardening organization with the hesitancy to go back into schools and reassessing like what we will look like. And I think trying to focus on creating like some virtual green roof training that is financially accessible is going to be our next project. So yeah, definitely check us out there at Plant a Seed Project on Instagram. If you just want to chat, shoot the shit. I've recently become a big fan of Twitter in the last year. So at Mr. Mike Spade on Twitter.
I fucking love Twitter's still my favorite. It's totally like a generational thing though. It's like every generation has like a social media platform that speaks to him. Awesome. Well, Mike, thank you for coming on and talking some shit with us, and you know, good luck out there, and you know, good luck being a dad.
Hey, thank you. Almost forgot there for a second. That's where we started. But yes, thank you guys. It's a pleasure chatting with you. Keep the podcast going, man. I love the questions. I love the thoughtfulness. And I'm excited to see more down the line. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, and it was a pleasure to chat with you, and I think we'll we'll definitely have more interesting episodes coming up.